Right then. Well, I think we will make a start. Welcome everybody to this lightning talks session, the closing session of our Troubling Anniversaries conference hosted by the Institute of Historical Research and Queen's University Belfast Centre for Public History. I'm Catherine Clark. I'm based at the IHR. I'm the director of our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. So this event, the whole conference, has been part of our IHR centenary programme, reflecting on the past, present and future of history making, but also an opportunity to think critically about anniversaries and how we use anniversaries to think about and remember the past. This event has also been an expanded version of the annual QUB Public History Conference, and we're really delighted. It's been such a privilege to collaborate on such a wonderful, rich, stimulating event. So this session is going to be a real treat. As I said, we want it to have a kind of informal and festive feel. So I've encouraged people to bring a drink. If you have a glass to hand, that would be lovely. And we're going to have a tour through, a whistle stop tour really, a whiz through lots of fantastic research projects. To give you a bit of background, we put out a call for ECRs, early career researchers, to present on topics broadly associated with the themes of anniversaries, public memory, commemoration, public history. And we were overwhelmed with the response that we had and the wonderful proposals that we received. So everyone who's presenting today really is already a winner. They've done incredibly well to get onto this shortlist. It was very competitive. So well done and thank you everyone. And thanks to everyone who showed interest in this session. So of course, the main thing now is that we're all really looking forward to hearing about your brilliant research projects. But there is also a kind of fun, gamified, competitive angle to this evening as well. So we have some cash prizes up for grabs. If you didn't all have your mics off, we'd be hearing the oohs at that point, but your mic's off, so anyway. So cash prizes, a winner's prize of £200 and two runners-up prizes of £100 each. So, and I've discussed this with all the speakers, they know the deal. To be fair to everyone, we're going to be quite strict with the rules. All the speakers know that they have 5 minutes each, and I will cut them off if they go over length. So I'm really hoping they don't. I don't want to be the bad guy. I don't want to have to do that. But those are the rules of the game. So 5 minutes each and no longer. We also, I'm conscious, have to get through 9 presentations, plus the judges' deliberation and then coming back with the prize giving all before 6 o'clock. So we're going to have a busy and fun couple of hours, bit of a roller coaster. Just before we move on to the lightning talks themselves, I wanted to say one last thing, and I wanted to acknowledge and appreciate how wonderful the audience have been all the way through this Troubling Anniversaries conference. You've played a really rich and vital and energizing and provocative and challenging role with some amazing questions and discussion. And I'm really aware that many of you are doing your own fascinating research on anniversaries and public history and public memory. So if you're on social media, I'd really encourage you to introduce yourself and your own work using the hashtag Troubling Anniversaries, so that maybe we can use that as a space to share and connect beyond the Zoom room as well. We'd love to hear about what you're all working on. Right, okay, well this is uncharted territory for me. I'm just messing around with my stopwatch on my phone at the ready. So let's go, I guess. So let's move on to our presentations. And our first speaker is Laura Del Alazal from Birkbeck University of London. And Laura's going to speak to us on The Invisible Empire Does Not Exist. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you. So good afternoon, good evening from India, and wherever you are in the world, let's take a lightning round through Trafalgar Square to see that the invisible empire does not exist. So imagine you are in this beautiful symbol of the city of London and the United Kingdom, just a few minutes away from other important landmarks such as the British Museum or the Buckingham Palace. Actually, you don't need to imagine, we can just go there for a few seconds because this is live footage from Trafalgar Square. So as some of you know, this is recorded from this drone, which is part of the artwork, The End, showcased in the 4th plinth of Trafalgar, which is this pedestal, and it's probably the most famous public art commission in the world, according to the Mayor of London. And in our little trip to Trafalgar Square, you would notice the fourth plinth because it's strikingly anachronistic in the middle of this complex filled with old, obscure, and dark statues of men that died centuries ago. So you would also probably notice this big column in the south entrance, which is Nelson's column. Admiral Nelson was part of the British Army in the Battle of Trafalgar of 1805. But we also have here George IV in an equestrian statue. George IV was considered the first king of the Pax Britannica, so the beginning of the global hegemony of the British Empire. There is also a statue of Henry Havelock, who was the leader of the British Army in the Indian Rebellion of 1857, where 100,000 Indian civilians were killed. And there is also an obelisk dedicated to Charles James Napier, who was the conqueror of the Sindh province in modern Pakistan. So you would also probably see these majestic lions resting at the feet of Nelson's column. And when I went there for the first time, I was 10 years old, and my dad told me that these lions were built with the melted metal from the cannons of the defeated Spanish fleet in the Trafalgar battle. And this was really shocking to me because it was like the lions were telling me, you Spaniards are losers. And I was a 10-year-old Spanish girl. But this was actually the point of Trafalgar Square. So Trafalgar Square was built in 1840 to commemorate the Battle of Trafalgar that happened just a few decades before in 1805. And when it was built, it was basically a symbol of the British Empire naval military prowess and also the new power that they had. But the fourth plinth was actually always empty because allegedly they didn't have enough funds to have a statue there. And then later on, there wasn't a unanimous decision of what to put there. So even though the complex was filled with these empire-related figures, the fourth plinth was empty until 1999 when the Royal Society of Arts started the Fourth Plinth Project to showcase contemporary works of art. And we can see here that it's the year 2000 because people are dressed like the Matrix. That's something very historical. And then the Mayor of London actually continued this project in 2005 with the Fourth Plinth Commission. And these artworks change every 2 years. So these are ephemeral commemorations of art. But even though they are ephemeral, I think that we should not forget them because they can tell us something about history and art as well. So I want to look at The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, which was the last artwork showcased before I came to India and before the global pandemic. And this is a reproduction of an ancient Assyrian lamassu that was destroyed by the Daesh in 2015. And the message of this artwork is just London and the United Kingdom value art, and we condemn the destruction of ancient pieces such as this. And just a few minutes away, we have actual original lamassus that were brought to Britain in the 19th and early 20th century. And the actual message was the same when in the 19th century and 20th century, they brought these sculptures. The message was, we value heritage, we want to protect this, and this is why we are bringing this here. So it's just a parallel about empire in the 19th, 20th century and empire nowadays. And the fact that it's showcased in Trafalgar Square also tells us something. And this artwork was also there when the public debate about statues. This is the Edward Colston statue from Bristol. So this has started to become a public debate. Who should have statues? Should slave traders have statues? And so on. I'm done. Okay, so I'm just going to finish saying that monuments can't be separated from the places where they are. And the fourth plinth is still a symbol of empire because it's a project that demonstrates that Britain is still a nation with power now in the cultural aspect, but it's it relates to the entire thing about the invisible empire not existent. So it's always visible. Thank you. And
Thank you so much, Laura. Well done. You just squeaked it in there. Brilliant. Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Well, I really felt like I was in Trafalgar Square with some of that. Brilliant. Right, we'll move swiftly on. So our next speaker is Alison Martin. If you want to share your screen now. Alison is at Queen's University Belfast, and she's going to speak to us on commemorating the centenary of the Easter Rising in Belfast in 2016. Thank you. Over to you, Alison.
During the spring of 2016, the main media focus tended to be on how the 100th anniversary of the Rising was being commemorated in Dublin. In many ways, this is unsurprising, as Dublin was the main centre of the uprising. Up to this point, however, there hasn't been a thorough scholarly examination of how the centenary of the Rising was commemorated in Belfast. It's been perhaps touched upon by scholars like John Brewer. But in order to do this, I'm going to look at sources like newspaper articles and council reports. So there's a number of reasons why the commemorations of the Rising in Northern Ireland had the potential for controversy. Northern Ireland is a divided society with two main narratives. So for nationalists, the Rising tends to be seen as a turning point in the quest for Irish independence, whereas for unionists, it tends to be seen as a violent insurrection against British rule, so not something they'd be keen to celebrate. In 2016, there was also another important centenary for unionists, the Battle of the Somme. So for them, it's the fatalities endured by the 36th Ulster Division, a different form of blood sacrifice that they'd be eager to commemorate. Northern Ireland is also a post-conflict society, and it's been argued that the Troubles have complicated the re-evaluation of the Rising. So this begs questions like, why was violence seen to be acceptable looking back in 1916 and justifiable, but not so during the Troubles? And such are the concerns of the executive that they played a lead role in commemorations. So one of the exhibitions in Belfast was the Reflections on 1916 at Belfast City Hall. So it focused on the Rising, the Somme, and the Battle of Jutland. And it really looked at the impact that these events had had on local lives. And when Teresa Fellers, the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, visited in 2016, she noted how every word had been carefully scrutinised in the exhibition. There was also Remembering 1916 Eurostories at the Ulster Museum, which was done in collaboration with academics from Queen's University. It included objects and belongings of those caught up in the events of 1916, with the Rising and the Somme, and it was the first time that these objects have been displayed together. And this exhibition really encouraged visitors to put the Rising into context, particularly of the First World War. Another thing that was unveiled in 2016 was a mural to the Core family. So this was a family from the Ormer Road, and it depicted Elizabeth and Neil Core. So they were members of Common the Band, the Women's Auxiliary of the Irish Volunteers, and they delivered dispatches in the lead up to the Rising. The two brothers, on the other hand, fought in the First World War, and George was killed at the Somme. So within the one family, it shows political divisions. A statue to James Connolly was also unveiled on the Falls Road in 2016. He'd been one of the leaders of the Rising, who was later executed for his role. He had a special connection to Belfast as he'd lived there in the years leading up to the Rising. So this statue received some opposition from unionists, as it was funded by the Council and the Housing Executive, but there could be some argument here as to what's being commemorated. Was it his nationalist credentials or his trade union activism? So in Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin was the most prominent party in terms of organising commemorative events of the Rising. And they organised a large parade from Divis Tower to Milltown Cemetery, but there was also other parades. So in Belfast over Easter weekend in 2016, there were 6 different faction-specific memorial events to the Rising. So within republicanism, this showed divisions, not just unity. There was also a civic dinner supposed to be held at Belfast City Hall, and representatives from various parties were supposed to attend, but the DUP boycotted this event, and this resulted in President Michael Higgins, the Irish president, refusing to attend. So again, this shows divisions between the parties in Northern Ireland. So to conclude, Northern Ireland has come a long way since the last major commemoration of the Rising in 1966, and hopefully it's in a more stable place. Not everyone may have wanted to commemorate the Rising, but the council and other cultural institutions ensured the historical importance was acknowledged. These events weren't without tension, as you might expect in a divided society, but in Belfast in 2016, the Rising was commemorated, in some quarters celebrated, but also reflected upon and put into wider historical context. Thank you.
Wow, Alison, thank you so much. What a masterclass in packing loads into a 5-minute slot. Really fascinating, and I think for those of us who've been present for the whole conference, it resonates with so many of the questions and topics that we've been exploring across the conference. Really wonderful. Thank you. So I will hand over now. I'll introduce our next speaker, Caitlin White of Trinity College, Dublin. And Caitlin is going to speak on memory, commemoration, and fake news, the potential of public history in the 21st century. Over to you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks so much to the organisers for including me in the session and to my other panellists for presenting such interesting topics. So as Catherine said, today I'm going to talk about the potential role that history, memory and commemoration can play in society. I am in my final year of my, why is my phone? Oh, there we are. I'm in my final year of my PhD, where I am researching monuments in the public space in 4 case study areas in the state formation years. And I'm using this research to implement workshops with students to investigate the impact that engaging with history can have on an individual. I believe that now, in 2021, just as our decade of centenaries is ending, Keith mentioned this programme of centenaries yesterday, the time is right to interrogate the historical narratives of the revolutionary period and state formation years. The future shape of the politics on this island is uncertain, but our only certainty is that it will change. Employing the theories of an agonistic mode of remembering in these workshops, I hope to encourage students to move away from a cosmopolitan mode, which has dominated commemoration and remembrance since World War II. Agonism recognises conflict and difference as part of the political process, but it does not require a shared consensus outcome, which can omit difficult aspects of history and leave some groups feeling forgotten. As historians, we are all acutely aware of the multiple ways in which the past can be used or manipulated to influence the present. Historical narratives are necessary to facilitate and promote social identities, but they can often be used to deepen societal divisions. As Alwyn Purdue argues in her recent publication on teaching public history in Northern Ireland, these narratives often lack nuance, and it is these simplified narratives that can be used and abused to further an individual or a group's interest. But I would argue that historical memory has the potential to be used to promote critical thinking skills, which are essential in our present era of fake news, multi-perspectivity, empathy, and reconciliation in post-conflict societies. In order to promote these in individuals, historical memory needs to be engaged with, interrogated, and critiqued. Public history might be a term that's familiar to most of you here, but to briefly summarise, it's a subdiscipline of history that's about history in the public space, the study of it and the production of it. It is inherently interdisciplinary, and to be a public historian is to be a multitasker. Public historians use sources and work with stakeholders that wouldn't ordinarily feature in the traditional study of history. So in order to create these workshops that would be viable, ethical, and engaging, I used methodologies, theories, and advice from a range of disciplines and sources. Drawing particularly from the work of Faye Sayre and Philip Seitz, and using hypotheses developed by Alan McCulley and Keith Barton, and my own research on monuments, I designed workshops for students on local case studies. In these workshops, each student is given a survey to complete before the workshop takes place, and then we discuss social identity and commemorative theory. We do various activities such as creating a timeline, imagining the lives of real people in the past, and using newspaper articles to chart the monument from conception to unveiling. We visit the monument and we discuss the people featured on it, and then the students are asked to fill out a survey identical to the one they filled out at the beginning. These surveys ask students to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 their opinions on different statements, and the results have been amazing. So preliminary results indicate that engaging with these case studies made students feel more interested and more connected to their local area's history, which is always great news for us historians. But further analysis reveals something even more exciting. So for students who scored 5 or below on their likelihood to critically analyse sources about the past before taking part in the workshop, their likelihood of doing so after the workshop rose by 36%. So you can see from this graph that their incline, there on the blue line, is much steeper than their peers, who were more likely to question sources presented to them before the workshop even began, but who still improved their critical thinking skills by 14%. So the improvement in critical thinking skills is key for students across the island, as studies have shown that people with these skills are better able to navigate fake news, a significant contributor to the rise of extremist politics. Not only that, but these workshops also foster multi-perspectivity through engaging in an agonistic mode of remembering, along with empathy for people of the past. This multi-perspectivity is what Alan McCulley has identified as critical in furthering reconciliation efforts in Northern Ireland in a meaningful and lasting way. So in short, this research has proven what historians have known all along, that public history has the potential to make the world a better place. I am, of course, being facetious, but I think that is allowed on a Friday evening. I have a list of further reading that I'm happy to share with anyone that is interested, but for now, Gurv Míle Maithagh Astord. Thank you all very much.
Oh, lovely, Caitlin. Thank you so much. Yes, and I'm sure you have an audience very much in agreement with what you're saying about the value and importance of public history there. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Right, I'm learning more than I think I've ever learned in an hour, going through so much really varied and fascinating material. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Joshua Dite from Edge Hill University, who's going to speak on making a meal out of remembrance, Chartist banquets and newspaper representations of radical memory. Over to you, Joshua.
Can anyone see the screen okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yep. Okay, so on the 6th of February 1841, the Chartist newspaper, the Northern Star, reported several accounts of Chartists celebrating what would have been the 104th birthday of illustrious radical Thomas Paine. Combined into this one section, we find a mosaic of portrayals, with radicals in Martha Tydfil, Wales, remembering Paine for his international and revolutionary principles. In Nottingham, he was celebrated but also repudiated for his theological opinions, and in Kensington, he was upheld as a figure sweeping away superstition. By comparing these different reports on anniversary celebrations, we see how Chartist responses to the past were not unified, but composed of multiple fragments that formed what Luisa Passerini calls the layers of memory. Paine was not the only radical to be celebrated at events such as this. A welter of radical heroes were regularly commemorated through a radical calendar of anniversaries. This, combined with a committed press recirculating this material, gives a sense of the volume of representations Chartists constructed from the late 1830s to the early 1850s. And such oppositional commemoration empowered Chartist ideology and buffeted its identity against elite commemoration, wresting titles like the Father of Reform from elite Whig gentlemen like Earl Grey and applying them to radical icons like Paine. It is perhaps unsurprising then that a mixture of unique and overlapping portrayals emanated from a pantheon that was intangible and freely accessible. By documenting commemorative banquets, the Chartist press disseminated radical memory to readers and has enabled a means for recovering these representations. If, as Andrew Woods has observed, customs provide a discursive space for memory, the newspapers transmuted this remembrance from an in-person experience to a printed one. And in doing so, the press enabled the fluidity of memory to switch meanings, as we see with the example of Paine, and at the same time, they challenged this form, capturing and preserving fleeting portrayals that may otherwise have been forgotten. Transcripts of commemorative banquets, such as the one to Henry Hunt in 1845, show how separate voices added to these layers. Whilst attendees collectively cheered toasts to an illustrious dead, individual speeches in newspaper reports display the heterogeneous nature of memory. At a London Democratic supper held in Leicester Square on the 6th of November, three key Chartist figures each spoke on the past in varying ways. Fergus O'Connor denounced the power of memorials as tyrants, selecting usurpers as fitting statues, whilst George Julian Harney instrumentalised the rights of man to the present situation in Poland. And finally, the poet laureate of Chartism, Thomas Cooper, took an imaginative, romanticised view of the past to reclaim ancient figures like Spartacus as working class. In contrast with this banquet, the Northern Star reported commemorations at several other sites between the 5th and the 8th of November. In London, there was a greater outpouring to international radicalism. In Oldham, the focus is upon mainly English patriots, and in Ashton-under-Lyne, the emotions of the occasion rendered a more melodramatic portrayal. Once again, we can identify an interplay between vernacular histories in one region and the more general pantheonizing sentiment to illustrious patriots. So Chartist anniversary dinners offer some of the most concentrated conjurations of the past. And by analysing them, we can appreciate the multitude of representations and their complexities. And through this practice, we are reminded of the ability of anniversaries to synchronise a patchwork of regional politics across Britain and reflect the magnitude of Chartism itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. That was wonderful. And yeah, this conference, we began with quite a lot of discussion about the sort of the problems associated with hanging so much of our history and our public history on anniversaries. And it's lovely to end with, maybe we should go back to that idea of a radical calendar of anniversaries. I love that kind of radical and subversive anniversaries that we could commemorate in different ways. Some of you may have noticed that my counting and arithmetic has been rather lacking. So there are not 9 of us, there are 8 people presenting, which means we have 3 presentations left to go. So we're going to move next to Daniel Frost from the University of Reading. And Daniel's going to just start to share screen now. Fantastic. And his presentation is Racism is Not an Isolated Incident, Croydon's 1981, Croydon's 2011, and Troubling Memories in the Multicultural Suburb. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so it's 10 years since the England-wide uprisings following the police shooting of Mark Duggan. And whilst rioting took place in Tottenham and Brixton, it was their spread to outer suburban areas of London like Ealing and Croydon which caused most alarm. Contrasts were often made with another of this year's anniversaries. As Rupert Huck observed, media portrayals implied previously respectable suburbs were now, quote, besieged by marauding hordes of swarming youths, typically delegitimized by comparison to the seemingly more political uprisings in Brixton in 1981, although some commentators, including Darcus Howe, by 2011 living in Croydon, made the comparison more favorably. For good or bad, with justifiable cause or without, 2011 suggested that black anger had been unleashed in London's outer suburbs for the first time. This narrative misrepresents the histories of suburbs like Croydon, including Croydon's 1981, when local activists reported regular racist violence associated with drinkers at the Wilton Arms in Thornton Heath, where the National Front was headquartered. Shortly after the Brixton Uprising, on 1st of June 1981, a group of black young people gathered in nearby Melfort Park to plan a counterattack on the pub, during which a teenaged white bystander, Terence May, was killed. The subsequent Croydon 15 campaign on the defendant's behalf included activists from Race Today, like Howe, and locals Femi Adelaja and Winford Jameson, pictured here, who, after another meeting in Melfort Park, established the Croydon Black People's Action Committee in a squatted town centre building. They were later awarded funding from the Greater London Council for a police monitoring unit. And whilst these events received extensive coverage, they have been little remembered. Uprisings in other spaces like Brixton are treated as unsurprising and compare favourably to apparently exceptional violence in supposedly suburban Croydon. Already in disarray and heavily criticised by Race Today by the time the GLC was dissolved in 1986, the black youth organisations which it had supported have left little trace. And this is apparent in the way the events are remembered in 1992, when an Afghan refugee, Ruhollah Aramesh, was beaten to death by white youths in Thornton Heath. Recounting the same incident later described by her grandchild, Jay Bernard, in this poem, the Labour councillor G. Bernard addressed an anti-Nazi League protest, saying that her own son was almost murdered in that identical spot in 1981. She then declared, "Racism is not an isolated incident. The colleges, the schools, the council, and all the bureaucracy of Britain is racist, and I'm not ashamed to say that because it is what it is." By 1992, however, even the Conservative Council had sponsored an ethnic minorities forum, and other speakers emphasised Croydon's status as a multicultural suburb. A forum representative criticised the insidious racism that has been creeping into the hitherto harmonious relationships between all the people of Croydon, and praised the police specifically, whilst Aramesh's uncle argued that the Nazis represent only a tiny minority. Though, as Les Back pointed out, the incident suggested suburban racism remained, activists claimed to speak on behalf of Croydon meant forgetting the racism which Bernard had highlighted. Moreover, all the speakers spoke consciously as adults and as parents in the place of the younger activists of the early 1980s. Neither the earlier disturbances nor Aramesh's killing are usually mentioned in coverage of subsequent incidents of public racism, like these in Croydon, or the 2011 riots. nor are Croydon's history of National Front activism or the presence of the Home Office immigration headquarters in the town centre. The connection's not made. Whereas Lambeth's Ted Knight famously described the police in Brixton as an army of occupation, Croydon North's Labour MP Steve Reed, elected in 2012, condemned the mindless hooliganism of the previous year. And you can see a contrary tweet there. Croydon's image has changed considerably since the 1980s, and its changing demographics have been closely linked to Labour's contemporary success there. Yet the borough has never had a Black or Asian MP, and despite Pride and Storms' success, it's a difficult town to find a venue for bashment, grime or drill. 10 years on, people are more comfortable celebrating local Black musicians than considering the 2011 uprisings and their causes. I want to suggest that Croydon's 1981 and its absent memorialisation tell us at least 3 things about Croydon's 2011 and its 2021. London suburbs have long been a frontline in Black British history, not confined to the othered spaces of Brixton and Tottenham. An emphasis on the innocence of those involved in public disorder can detract from adequately remembering the situations to which it responded. And the multicultural suburb continually forgets and disguises the systemic racism and public violence which have always permeated the suburban nation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. That was really powerful. And I love the way that you showed so effectively with those different media cuttings, the very different kind of narratives and perspectives and appropriations of events there. Thank you so much. We just have 2 presentations left in this part of the session. So we're going to move right on to our next speaker, Julia Volkmar at Queen's University Belfast. And her presentation is Erste Bürgerpflicht Erinnerungskultur, how contemporary witnesses struggle to maintain the burden of dealing with the past in Germany. Over to you, thanks.
Thank you so much, and thanks to my other panelists as well. It's been incredibly interesting so far. I think we are due some translations to start with. My title, Erste Bürgerpflicht Erinnerungskultur, roughly translates into First Citizen's Duty is the Culture of Remembrance. And whilst this is a German saying, it's highly satirical, but I think it does describe quite well how Germany is seen for its culture of remembrance, or its dealing with the past abroad as being really conscious and being very good at dealing with the past, as such as the past of 2 dictatorships as well, whilst this also shows that there is some conflict arising with it. And before we dive into contemporary witnesses a wee bit more, I want to talk about oral history, and I think oral history as such, as Sean O'Connell's brilliant presentation this morning has shown, has really in the past decades earned its place, gained its place within transitional justice and within other mechanisms of dealing with the past. In Germany, oral history initially came about because the Allied forces used it to subsidize for written material that had been destroyed by the Nazis. So they interviewed and gained testimony from survivors of the Holocaust. And at the same time, these recordings of victims of the Holocaust especially have gained international prominence in museums and online archives later, and have then been transformed really to as recordings of advocacy for victims. And oral history in Germany especially has this become recognized as preserving testimony, as allowing victims to reclaim their own narrative, as highlighting experiences, and also as a space of commemoration. And in the German example, especially oral history has come into the form of education, and that is part of the whole collective responsibility and remembrance that is going on in Germany. That is the concept of contemporary witnesses. And those are victims and survivors, as much as partly perpetrators and or their families of the Second World War or the GDR regime, that are going into school classes to give their oral testimony to school children. I think I myself was 14 or something when I talked to contemporary witnesses with discussions after. And this is so anchored in the federal school curriculum that it is really thought to further the understanding of the lived past. And it's very popular with both teachers and, from my experience at least, students as well. So what is the problem with that? The problem is that it's very much unclear if it works. You here see some of the national headlines in the last couple of years, and I do apologize for the really clunky translations partly, but it highlights that German students do not know as much about history as they have thought so. And one thing that is a problem with that or the concept of contemporary witnesses. First of all, students feel absolutely overwhelmed talking to people that are speaking about their own experiences, find it really hard to distance themselves, and therefore do not ask critical questions. Second, whilst they really enjoy talking to contemporary witnesses, there's suggestive evidence that they do not actually retain as much as through traditional history lessons. And lastly, there is the obvious problem that many contemporary witnesses are already old and frail, if you wish, and that this practice therefore needs to be adapted in one way or another. So the question is, what do I propose to maintain the positive effects of oral history whilst updating the history curriculum, basically, and that is very much borrowed from my own research in oral history and transitional justice. So what now? There are three different things I propose. So first of all, there are oral history witnesses in education, but usually a class of students will only speak to one of them. So participative development together with more than one witness would be really, really useful for both students and reclaiming narrative of contemporary witnesses. Secondly, there are already existing repositories that go above and beyond what is discussed in skill classes. And I think they deserve to be featured much more than they originally and now are. And lastly, speaking of that, I think we can all learn from the past and from oral history, and it's important that that happens more than just once at skill. We all learn from repetition. Therefore, I would want to encourage all of you to speak out about the past, because we can all be contemporary witnesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. I love the way that ended with proposals and a kind of manifesto. So much we can learn in the UK, I think, from the German use of witness testimonies in education, but really interesting to have those critical reflections and interrogation of that too. Thank you. And finally, our last speaker in our lightning talks, we have Matthew Rowley of the University of Leicester. And Matthew's presentation for us this evening is Colonial History and Belonging to America, Reflections on the 400th Anniversary of Thanksgiving. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen. We can see some of the kind of presentation apparatus around it, but that's probably fine.
Okay. Yeah, let me. I think that'll be fine for now.
Yeah, we can see it. Yeah.
All right. In the lead up to the 400th anniversary of Thanksgiving this autumn, I edited a collection of essays on history, memory, immigration, and identity. I'm also part of a team organizing university conferences, seminars, online essays, and newspaper and magazine articles on the same themes. In other words, I'm working hard to productively reflect on one of America's troubling anniversaries. For this presentation, I chose to describe one illustration from 1869, so you'll see it on the screen. It captures the power of history and memory to steer the nation in welcoming and inclusive directions. History, Thanksgiving, and immigration constructively collide in an iconic illustration by Thomas Nast for Harper's Weekly that appeared in 1869. Nast sketched a capacious vision for a post-Civil War America. He placed, quote, "Come one, come all, and free and equal" in the bottom corners. Blindfolded justice presided over the table as presidents adorned the walls. Beneath Abraham Lincoln are his immortal words from the second inaugural address, "with malice towards none and charity to all." And below these words sit a Southern gentleman who was a former enemy. George Washington occupies the central portrait, along with Ulysses S. Grant in the words 15th Amendment and peace. Uncle Sam stands at the right above everyone else, and he serves guests who seem preoccupied with the other people at the table. Behind Uncle Sam hangs a painting of Castle Garden, and this was the place where immigrants entered the United States. The word welcome boldly invites outsiders. People from around the world gather for this feast. Presumably, they would bring their religion with them. The depiction of children in the image suggests that these groups will increase and multiply, filling the United States while subduing it. The recently passed 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States. At the foot of the table, a white woman, Lady Liberty or Columbia, sits between an African American and someone of Asian descent. The threesome engage in a discussion with the white woman looking directly at her conversation partner. Even a century after this image was produced, such intimacy was risky for a person of color. Crucially, women sit at the table alongside men, and at the center of the table is, quote, self-government and universal suffrage. From one perspective, this illustration reinforces stereotypes about each group. However, from another perspective, it implies that one need not shed their cultural or religious garb to be welcomed to Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner. In other words, there was no loss of identity or cultural distinctives, as was the case in the melting pot approaches to American identity and unity. This illustration provoked strong reactions. The Troy Daily Times praised the visualization as a universal welcome. It also provoked disgust and fear. The Morning Oregonian ran a story titled "Scared by a Picture." Most famously, George Friedrich Keller parodied Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner for an anti-immigrant periodical, the San Francisco Wasp. He presented non-white dinner guests as uncivilized purveyors of disorder and chaos, and a horde of additional immigrants waited to be seated, stoking fears of worse yet to come. Peoples were reduced to their worst stereotypes in this alternative image. This rival Thanksgiving was far more racist, and its lesson was clear. Civilized holidays were a whites only affair. Sadly, Keller's vision of Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner seemed to triumph over Nast's vision. Shortly after this picture, rights for African Americans were rolled back after the failure of Reconstruction. American Indians continued to be dispossessed, and increasing immigration restrictions made Uncle Sam a less welcoming host. Women were not invited to feast on self-government. So as I close, I want to leave you with these questions. If we think of the nation as a table, perhaps a Thanksgiving one, who belongs around it? Who is the host and who the guest? What are the criteria for inclusion and who gets to decide? When discussing these questions, we must never forget that the table was carved of wood from Native American forest. It sits squarely on their ancestral lands, and they are seated at the table, demanding a voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you so much. I love the way you just drew everything out of that one really rich, really provocative, fascinating image, and left us with those very provocative questions as well for us to consider. Thank you so much. Right, well, we have come to the end of our wonderful lightning presentations. Thank you so much to all our speakers. As others I've noticed already saying in the chat, what a fantastic kind of journey through so many wonderful different topics, and I've certainly learned so much over the last hour, and so many varied and engaging styles of presentation. Really wonderful. So just again to emphasize that the main purpose of this session.
You're muted, Catherine.
I've been muted the whole time. I'm so sorry. No. Did anyone hear me thank Matthew? Has that all been silent? You did?
Yeah, you were saying the...
Oh, how funny. I wonder how that happened. Must have accidentally clicked on something. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of remind us all that the main purpose of this session is to give a platform to all these amazing research projects, and it's been a privilege to hear from you all, and of course the platform for these presentations is much wider than those who are in the room right now. We'll be sharing most of this session as a recording after the conference as well, and lots of other people have the opportunity to catch up with these wonderful presentations. So we're really grateful to you for sharing some insights into your research. Incredibly difficult in 5 minutes, but you did brilliantly well. Of course, there is also the competition element this evening to give it all a bit of a structure. So what's going to happen now is that the judges are going to withdraw to Teams. Teams is kind of like the room next door here. So we're going to head over to Teams, and that will be Olwen Perdue and Niamh Cullen and Hiroki Shin and myself. And we're going to depart now and discuss your presentations, while Claire Langemer, Director of the IHR, will offer some responses to your presentations and some closing words, and perhaps some opportunities for others to comment and discuss as well. I do see that on Twitter, some people have already taken up our invitation to introduce yourselves and share your own research with our hashtag Troubling Anniversaries, which is lovely to see. So I'd encourage others to do that. So I'll hand over now to Claire, and we will be back shortly. Thanks so much, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Catherine. I just want to start by reiterating what Catherine said, really, was that was just a real joy to listen to. And the format of the quick talks and having so many in the same space and working with each other has just been so beautiful. And I think that as a whole, they've really shown the kind of the power of the past in the present, the complexity of memory, the complexity of commemoration practices. I think they've also shown what is at stake for us, whether we're historians, whether we come from other disciplines, whether we're interdisciplinarians, the things that are at stake for practitioners, for activists, and also for the very many overlapping communities, but also individuals. One of the really striking things was that intimacy around commemoration practices and memory. I think they also suggest broader questions about the role of scholarship within talk about what happened in the past, and then the question of how we commemorate what happened in the past. And I was really struck in this session, and also I was struck by this in the first session as well, just how apt the title of the conference really is, this sense of a troubling of the layers. And a couple of you mentioned the layers of memory and the layering of anniversaries on anniversaries on anniversaries, or indeed the reverse, the absence of a consciousness of this layering, was really, really interesting. And I think is such a poignant demonstration of the way in which past, present, and imagined futures sit together in a moment and do so much work. There are, of course, a number of very more specific themes which have emerged in these talks, and I've been tasked with kind of pulling out in as much as I'm capable of doing at this time on a Friday, I have to say, without a glass of wine to hand, and this is a terrible error on my part. But I think what I'd really like to say is how well they sit together as a set of papers. It seems almost invidious to be awarding prizes for these. There are various things that kind of just I was thinking about and thinking with as the talks went, and some of these are shared themes, and some of these are things that stood out from what the individual papers said. So I'm just going to raise a few of them. Partly, I don't know how much time we have. We may have hours. We may be in here for the long haul, get your duvets out. This is your Friday night. Or we may not have very much time at all. And I do want to also have some space for other people's comments. But the things that really struck me, place and space. I mean, that beautiful job that Laura did around a square and that journey through it. And really sort of focusing us in. I think a number of the papers did this really, what some people have described really positively as a kind of a small history approach, but which just takes us into these most important questions that historians are facing today. The importance of context. came out again and again. I mean, Alison, in talking about how the whole context of 1916 in 2016, and the way in which the contexts work together, and the complexities and problematics of that. I mean, as historians, our gift to the world is context, and it's, you know, thinking about how that works around a particular year is so interesting. The monuments, things, the role of things in all of this. We're now quite familiar with the arguments around statues, but they're no less powerful to us. But I was also really struck by Caitlin's phrase, to be a public historian is to be a multitasker. And that sense of just how much public historians need to think about and be aware of. Julia, I mean, place again, but also really bringing out that sense of the work that the past does in all sorts of different ways. And I think that is a theme that came out across the panel. Who is putting the past to work and why? And also, I guess, the unruliness of that past when it is put to work. The layers of memory, Joshua, the layers of memory, you know, that really lovely sense of, I think you put it, I think you said, your phrasing was, and I apologize if I got your phrasing wrong, but commemorative activity as a way of synchronizing a patchwork of regional politics through memory. I mean, it was such a lovely phrasing, but really that sense of layers of memory in a moment through a particular medium. I mean, I could really feel that sense of all of those newspaper accounts almost on the desk, kind of working together, as well as across time. Also, the importance of what isn't remembered and the conscious unremembering of what has gone on in terms of Daniel's presentation, and those really useful questions that you ended, or those points that you ended with there around the history of Black British history within that kind of suburban context, and the kind of insistence on forgetting that, and what, again, what work that forgetting is actually doing. Julia, that the sort of your final point that we can all be contemporary witnesses really raised questions there for me about what our responsibility is as educators and as historians who are kind of out in the world. And then finally, Matthew, I'm a bit of a sucker for capacious vision. I love capacious anything. And your study of that particular image was absolutely so beautiful. But those questions, the question of who makes the decisions, you know, who gets to decide? And I think that question really can be applied across lots of this commemorative work. You know, who really is getting to make decisions about what is remembered, what is not remembered, how it's remembered, where it's remembered, whether it's remembered in lasting ways or whether it's remembered for a moment. So I think you've all just rather beautifully just raised so many more questions even than the conference so far has raised. So I would like to thank you for that.